I hesitate to say that U.S.-Pakistan relations are in crisis because, quite frankly, they've been in crisis for years now. They're always in crisis. But this past year, I think you can say with confidence, has been the worst year we've had, at least in the last decade, possibly in our relationship with modern Pakistan since 1947. I mean, there was a point in the 1990s when we were actively sanctioning them, but at no point were we, at the end of a barrel facing one another across the border with a real risk and a real possibility of military confrontation or armed conflict. It's still not likely, but it's no longer a remote possibility. So let me just talk a little bit about how we got here this past year. The year began in January with the Raymond Davis affair. This was a CIA contractor who was confronted mysteriously by two Pakistanis who were armed in Lahore. It's unclear whether or not they pulled their guns on him, but he fired on them, killed them, was taken into Pakistani custody. He was a CIA contractor, so we argued he deserved diplomatic immunity. The Pakistanis didn't want to give it to him. This literally dragged on for 3 months before he was finally released, but it caused a severe rupture in diplomatic relations. Pakistan expelled several military trainers, expelled...
You might mention the basis on which he was released as well.
Yes, well, that's right. He was released when blood money was paid to his family, which is enshrined in Pakistan's sort of arcane legal code. So...
the families of the victims.
The families of the victims, that's right. Apologies. But, we had CIA contractors expelled, military trainers expelled, visas denied to U.S. officials. And amidst this, there's a series of drone strikes, which I actually must give the administration credit for. They've significantly upgraded the number of drone strikes into Pakistan's tribal areas. And, there was a couple inconveniently timed or conveniently timed drone strikes, depending on how you look at it. But there were while U.S. officials were in Pakistan negotiating with the Pakistanis, or immediately after leaving Pakistan, there'd be a high-level drone strike on a high-value target, which caused a lot of animosity on the Pakistani side. And then, of course, you had their continuing refusal to go into North Waziristan and confront the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. I mean, this is something we've been urging them to do for 4 or 5 years now, and it's been a constant irritant in the relationship. And then, this is before May, when we had the bin Laden raid, which was really a turning point, I think, for both sides. The implications were obvious. It awoke Americans' eyes to the severity and the depth of Pakistan's relationship with militants. But it also had dynamics on the Pakistani side because the generals in Pakistan began pressuring the chief of staff there, Kiani. Much of the mid and even now senior level military officials over there are quite anti-American. And this was, this gave them momentum to begin pressing Kiani to take a tougher stance against the U.S., to expel America, to cut off cooperation with us. And at the same time, on our side, you had the U.S. Congress taking a harsher stance toward the administration. In July, cutting $800 million in aid, insisting on tougher requirements for dispersing aid to Pakistan. So you had a lot of momentum on both sides pushing for some fundamental changes, including within the administration itself. You had Secretary Gates, who was more friendly to Pakistan than others in the administration, leave, and Leon Panetta came in, who as CIA chief for the previous year had seen how bad the Pakistanis were playing us. I think he has a more realistic view of Islamabad than Gates did. And you had Petraeus come into the CIA. Petraeus was in Afghanistan the year before, so he knows how well the Pakistanis have been playing us there. So you now have someone in the Defense Department and the CIA who are less, pro-Pakistani than their predecessors. And you had Admiral Mullen, who was perhaps Pakistan's best friend in the administration, not for any bad reason, but because he was trying to foster a personal relationship with Pakistan's military leaders in the hopes that that would somehow make progress. He was there for 22 times he went to Pakistan to meet with their chief of staff. Tried his best to foster some kind of personal relationship with Kiani, and as we all know, that failed. Because Admiral Mullen, in September, on the eve of his departure from the Joint Chiefs, came before Congress and said, the Haqqani network is a veritable arm of the ISI. Basically, our top military commander finally going on the record and saying, Pakistan's intelligence services directly fund and arm the militants who are killing us every day. This is what South Asia experts have been saying for years, but no one in the administration had been willing to go that far. So this was a really profound statement. Not that anything's been done about it since, but you now have the senior military official in the U.S. on the record saying that. So when a congressman goes home to his constituents and has to justify, in an era of budget cuts, more money going to what is by all accounts a state sponsor of terrorism, he's going to have a much more difficult time moving forward. So just to finish up with this turbulent year, last month we had a terrible miscommunication. U.S. forces attacked a Pakistani border post along the Afghan-Pakistan border. Again, the circumstances surrounding it are slightly mysterious. The U.S. patrol on the Afghan side said they were taking fire from the Pakistani side. It may have in fact been flares being fired. But in any event, they called in air support. There was a miscommunication between the Americans and the Pakistanis, and we fired on 2 of their border posts, killing 24. Now they responded with outrage. And they've essentially, in the aftermath of this attack last month, played many of the cards that they have to play against us. So they shut down the border posts. Most of our supplies going into Afghanistan, at one point 90% of our supplies, go through 2 road links into Afghanistan, through the Chaman border crossing and the Khyber Pass. That number has been reduced, but they closed both of these road links, and they're still closed today. It's been almost 4 weeks now. They refused to attend the Bonn conference, which was being held in Germany to discuss the future of Afghanistan. This was supposed to be the big conference 10 years after the original Bonn conference at the start of the Afghan war, to determine how we are going to come to some kind of resolution with us, with our withdrawal pending. How are we going to come to some kind of negotiated settlement with the Taliban? Pakistan's involvement was seen as crucial. They pulled out and refused to go. And the last thing they did was evacuate us from the Shamsi air base. All those drone strikes you hear about in Pakistan's tribal areas, the vast majority of them are launched from within Pakistan at the Shamsi air base, which is actually operated by the UAE in a sort of strange arrangement. But they've threatened this on many occasions, and finally after this attack on their 2 border posts last month, they pulled the trigger and they kicked us out of the Shamsi air base. In addition to that, we've put drone strikes into the tribal areas on hold, so we haven't had any drone strikes there in the past month or so. They issued new orders to their troops to return fire. If an event happens like this again, they've moved new anti-aircraft batteries to the border, and they've issued regulations that basically make it a lot easier for us to get into some kind of shooting war with them if another miscommunication like this happens again. But, in a way, all these hurt us and hurt our mission in Afghanistan, but they also have, brought into clear focus. It's essentially like weaning ourselves off a drug. I mean, by allowing them to play their cards, we've reduced their leverage against us moving forward. They no longer have the option to say, well, we'll kick you out of Shamsi if you don't do this for us, or we won't help you negotiate with the Taliban if you don't do this for us. So let's talk about moving forward. The thing hanging over, the main issue hanging over U.S.-Pakistan relations moving forward is the impending withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's going to happen in 2014, and there's no question it's bad for the war on terror. There's no question it's awful for Afghanistan. But if you wanted to look on a bright side, I think it is good for our Pakistan policy, which, if you really take a thoughtful look at the region, Pakistan is the problem. It's not Afghanistan. And why is it good for our Pakistan policy? Because of some of the reasons I mentioned before. The leverage Pakistan holds over us, we know that they're playing us for fools. Everyone knows that. But the reason we can't do much about it is because they hold leverage over us, principally the logistics routes into Afghanistan. There was no way for us to supply our troops if we decide to crack down on the Pakistanis and they say, well, we're cutting you off. Now, we've tried to reduce this dependence as much as possible. It was at one time, it was 90% of the supplies moving in. Now we've got it down to about 30% because we've opened up the northern distribution network through Russia and Central Asia. We're airlifting more supplies in. But even this is a little problematic. Russia is now waffling a bit on the northern distribution network. Now they're holding that as leverage over our heads on missile defense issues. The Manas Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, they have a new president there. He said he wants us out by 2014. And even though we've reduced dependence through Pakistan's road links, we still are dependent on their airspace. We've simply upped the number of supplies we're flying in over Pakistani airspace. So even though we've reduced this leverage to some degree, they still will hold a key card over our head while we're in Afghanistan. So, you know, as much as it pains me to say it, we cannot achieve our goals in Afghanistan unless there is fundamental change in Pakistan. And that's something that's been reiterated on several occasions, but nothing has ever been done about it. So let me say, what can we do towards Pakistan? What does a U.S.-Pakistan relationship look like moving forward? I see it as becoming increasingly hostile. You know, again, as their leverage over us declines, we have less and less reason to tolerate them actively working against our interests the way they have for the past 10 years. We already know what it looks like when they play their cards against us because they've been doing it. But what does it look? What can we do in return once this leverage is removed? First of all, we can make it a transactional relationship. They always complain that, you know, the U.S. is involved in a transactional relationship. They want a strategic relationship. Well, that's fine. We should make it a transactional relationship. If you give us something good, we'll give you something back. Instead, it's been all $20 billion of aid flowing to them and nothing flowing back to us. And you can't blame them. You know, they make peace deals with the Taliban, we give them more money. They attack our troops, we give them more money. I mean, it's been a completely rational policy from their point of view. But what can we do moving forward if we do have some kind of fundamental break with them? I think we can strengthen our ties to India. It's something we've been doing gradually over the past few years. It's something that drives them up the wall, but it's something that's good for the U.S. in its own right. We can drop the Kashmir issue from the agenda, which has never been productive. We can increase defense sales to India, and we can invite them to play a more constructive role in Afghanistan, which the Pakistanis don't want. But if they're not helping play a constructive role there, we should ask somebody who will. We can openly support anti-Pakistan elements inside Afghanistan. They've been openly supporting anti-US elements there. We can play the same game if we choose to. We can label ISI officials, and then the ISI, and then the Pakistani state, if necessary, as terrorist institutions. They have exceeded all criteria established to be labeled a state sponsor of terror. We could use the same model that we have with the Revolutionary Guards with individuals. And we could progressively ratchet up tensions on them through targeted sanctions, through broader cutoff in aid, through pressure on the IMF, where they've gotten a lot of funds and loans in recent years. And we can pressure the Saudis and the Chinese, who are really their only two other friends, and who are not really their friends anyway. I mean, they count on the Chinese as their all-weather friend, but the Chinese have never really been willing to play the kind of patron role that the U.S. has. You know, there was awful flooding in Pakistan last year, and the U.S. gave $150 million in aid. The Chinese gave $5 million in aid. The Pakistanis this year invited the Chinese to come and build a military base at the port of Gwadar, and the Chinese said thanks, but no thanks. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. So while China does have a strong relationship with Pakistan because they use Pakistan to contain India, there are limits to the relationship, and if we made it a priority in our relations with China, if we said Pakistan is an incredibly serious issue for us, they're a nuclear weapons terrorist state, and we need you to come on board with this. You have no interest in Islamist terrorists anyway. You have your own problems in the West. We could with the Saudis and the Chinese, in concert, put more pressure on the Pakistanis. So there's a number of cards we have to play too. For too long, I think that this small nation, has held the world superpower hostage. And if this fundamental break is coming, I think that they need to be reminded that, in fact, we have our own cards to play.